What's up, New Wavers? Sorry I have been on a hiatus. This summer took the wind right out of me. And honestly, I needed to take a few weeks off to prioritize my mental health. Without going into a laundry list of excuses, I basically was pushed to the brink when it came to a full caseload, which I'm not complaining. I was taking 3 classes, I was teaching 1. I needed a break. So I took 2 weeks off from not seeing any clients, and I took actually probably 4 weeks off from shooting any content. I know that's the cardinal rule when it comes to YouTube, is to never take breaks, but a bitch is tired. So as I've mentioned and promised for literal months, I am finally starting my series called 6 Feet Deep Dive. As I've also mentioned, filming paranormal investigations takes time, energy, and money. And those are 3 things of which have been quite scarce lately. However, today I am fulfilling my promise of beginning this long-awaited YouTube series by my tens of viewers. I've been anticipating doing a series as a nice, healthy alternative to investigating murder sites, almost getting arrested, going into abandoned buildings and burial grounds. This feels a little bit more safe and a little bit more doable. Also, I got a perm. And as much as going to cemeteries, burial grounds, and haunted houses and murder sites all fill up my cup, they actually drain my energy in the short term. But in the name of self-care, this series will be filmed in the comfort of my own home, where I will be covering spooky and macabre things that I would have pretty much already hyperfixated on anyway if I were doing an investigation. So why not share all of my hyperfixations with all of you? So many of you have subscribed and left the kindest, sweetest comments and given me the most amazing feedback. And though I had to pause, I think, dare I say, I'm finally at a place where I can keep going. And so without further ado, welcome to season 1, episode 1, whatever this is, of 6 Feet Deep Dive. Wah. I'm feeling all fancy. I got me a microphone. So I had a few topics in mind for episode 1. I had a New Orleans grave robber who literally robbed the bones from pauper cemeteries in New Orleans and tried to sell them online for witchcraft. Sadly, this lore actually kind of lost its steam and I just became unhyperfixated, if that means anything. Hypo-fixated, if that's the correct term. And amidst all of this, I was actually watching a very recent episode of RuPaul's Drag Race All-Stars Season 9. And one of my favorite drag queens to ever exist, Got Mick, made a quote, and that is basically why this episode exists. Not only is Got Mick a spooky horror fan like myself, but he actually said a wonderful quote that actually inspired me to make this episode about queer representation in horror films. Got Mick said, "Horror is just so important to queer people. Queer people can watch these films and see themselves in the monsters. And how society shuns these creatures because they don't understand them. And girl, they're just trying to live." When I watched this on TV, not only did it make me feel super seen and super validated, like basically Got Mick just validated my whole existence, it also got me thinking, why not make episode 1 of 6 Feet Deep Dive, which is a passion project that I have wanted to do for months and months, why not make episode 1 about something that I know and love and can speak freely about? Queer representation in horror. So as a gay boy growing up in Houston, Texas, horror was my only escape. And I'm talking my only escape. From being bullied mercilessly in junior high and high school, to my parents screaming all the time at each other, to just feeling disconnected, lonely, isolated. Horror was the thing that I clung to. There were several moments where I was literally going to unalive myself when I was probably 13 or 14. And I remember just putting in a horror movie and that just fixed it. Horror essentially is the reason why I am alive today. No joke. Horror films are also simply a way for my soul to be fulfilled. But as I revisit all of the horror films that I watched growing up from a 36-year-old pair of eyes, I kind of cringe. Now, horror directors and screenwriters were not very kind to us. So disclaimer for you people in the back, queer is essentially a descriptive term of anyone under the LGBTQ umbrella. Queer is inclusive of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, but it's also far more inclusive than that. Queer is inclusive of non-binary people, asexual people, intersex persons, pansexuality, sapiosexuality, the list goes on and on and on. So I will be using queer in this context for a majority of this video. Now, as I said, horror directors and screenwriters were not very kind to queer people at all. I mean, at all. Imagine Hollywood being called out for doing something problematic yet again. So to encapsulate queer horror representation as much as possible, let's go all the way back to the 1930s when horror films as we know them today were introduced to cinema goers worldwide. Known for directing such immortal classics as The Invisible Man, Frankenstein, and its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein. James Whale was an openly gay director. He didn't hide it, but he also, from sources close to him, didn't flaunt it either. However, Hollywood was extremely heteronormative at the time. Well, it still is. So sadly, while many Hollywood actors, actresses, filmmakers, screenwriters, set designers, costume designers were queer or gay, they could not actually live out loud, nor could any form of queerness, whether that's a gay relationship, a lesbian relationship, be portrayed on screen. But regarding James Whale's openness about his sexuality, this was actually quite unusual for the 1920s and 30s. Let's not forget that in James Whale's home country of the UK, homosexuality was actually still considered illegal until, I think, 1967. Some have even said that Bride of Frankenstein is actually a subtext for gay relationships. And many actors who were involved in the making of the film, like Colin Clive, were actually rumored to be gay or bisexual themselves. But regardless if a gay subtext for Bride of Frankenstein was actually James Whale's intention, any form of queerness, like I said, could only be implied, but never fully shown. Sadly, James's career took a downfall in the 1950s, and he ended up drowning himself in his own pool. Some have even said that the result of his downfall was a direct result of homophobia in Hollywood. So after the 1950s had passed, horror had become pretty lackluster. But the 60s was kicked off with the iconic horror film Psycho, directed by none other than Alfred Hitchcock. However, there was no actual homosexuality in the film. But for those of you who don't know, Anthony Perkins, who is famous for playing Norman Bates, was actually gay in real life, but he died of AIDS-related causes in 1992. Essentially, he was secretly, in the film, a drag queen who was walking around killing people dressed as his mom in a dress and in a wig. And though so many parts of this film are both shocking and iconic, it doesn't really portray queerness in the best light. I mean, the shock and twist ending of it all is that a man dresses up as his mother and kills people out of impulse. And this was in the early 1960s. And due to the film's success, I think it further perpetuated negative stereotypes about any form of drag, any form of men who dress in women's clothing, or really any alternate form of gender expression. Basically, an unintentional side effect of this film is that it portrayed anybody who's expressing their gender differently than the gender that they were born, really as murderous monsters. Even the explanation at the ending after Norman Bates had gotten arrested was super pathologizing and super demoralizing, really, of any men who dress in women's clothing.
If he felt a strong attraction to any other woman, the mother's side of him would go wild.
After the runaway success of Psycho, the early to mid-60s really gave birth to a lot of really grimy exploitation films brought to you by none other than the king of gore, some say, Herschel Gordon Lewis, who brought us unforgettable classics. See what I did there? Like Blood Feast, 2000 Maniacs, and the Gore Girls. Yes, the Gore Girls. Much of his exploitation films really had more of a heterosexual theme to them. Basically, they were full of big-titted women and gratuitous gore scenes. And while Herschel Gordon Lewis and all of his exploitation films that were typically rated X were sweeping the nation, these underground exploitation films actually gave rise to the success of Russ Meyer's Faster Pussycat Kill Kill in 1965. Now, Russ Meyer was also a straight man who liked very curvaceous and very busty women in his films. But the different thing about Faster Pussycat Kill Kill is that it actually featured a lesbian relationship. The film centers its plot, or lack thereof, on a trio of murderous rebel women played by Haji, Tura Satana, and Lori Williams. The characters of Tura Satana and Haji actually play a lesbian partnership. However, it's only minorly hinted in the film, and if you're not looking close enough, you might actually miss it. And Faster Pussycat Kill Kill was also heavily featuring the male gaze. Because after all, it was an underground exploitation film that ended up actually gaining a huge cult following. A theme that you might actually notice throughout this film is that we finally have a lesbian couple that's on screen in a semi-horror film, but they are the antagonists. Go ahead and make a mental note of this. John Waters actually came around in the late 60s and early 1970s, where he completely revolutionized both exploitation films and horror. John Waters unapologetically made his films queer. He had to basically insert queerness in a raw and gritty way because at this time, we were screaming to be heard. The Stonewall riots were happening. Homosexuality was just removed from the DSM. And John Waters basically said, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. Now, John Waters not only is an openly gay man, but he featured his longtime collaborator, Divine, who sadly is no longer with us. Divine, what do I even say about her? Divine was raucous, she was rebellious, she was loud, she was often portrayed as aggressive and murderous.
Give us some of your political beliefs.
Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism. Eat shit. Eat shit.
John Waters made a series of films with Divine in them, such as Pink Flamingos, Female Trouble, Multiple Maniacs, not to be confused with the earlier mentioned 2000 Maniacs, even though that was probably a nod to Herschel Gordon Lewis. The thing about these, though, is they weren't entirely horror films, per se, as much as they were just cult, exploitation, camp, but they do feature as much gore as any horror film would, as well as some very disturbing scenes that I cannot and will not show on YouTube. However, John Waters actually did infuse queerness with murder and gore scenes, among many other kinds of debauchery in his films. I argue that John Waters, again a gay man, was the first person to openly, boldly, unapologetically merge queer representation and horror films. Yes, he featured Divine as the murderous antagonist who went on multiple killing sprees. John Waters did it in a very camp and very sarcastic way, almost to say a big F you to the big Hollywood producers that wanted to keep queer people in the dark. And while John Waters was exploding with queer creativity, cranking out film after film after film, mostly set and filmed in his hometown of Baltimore, across the Atlantic, the subgenre of lesbian horror films were actually sweeping European cinema. Now, one of my favorite films to come out of the lesbian vampire horror subgenre is Daughters of Darkness. Rob Zombie even uses a sample from this film in Living Dead Girl.
What are you thinking about?
The same thing you are.
What are you thinking about? Same thing you are. But regardless of its artistic integrity, Daughters of Darkness was one of the many lesbian vampire films to come out of Europe in the early 70s, along with Lust for a Vampire, Velvet Vampire,
The Velvet Vampire, starring Michael Blodgett, Sherry Miles, and Celeste Yarnow, in a strange triangle of love.
Vampiros Lesbos, and The Vampire Lovers. And though most of these films were actually really well done and had very high quality, a lot of them, again, were made from the male gaze. I mean, let's face it, straight men love watching lesbian porn. So some screenwriter out there, I'm not really sure who, but some person, probably a straight male in Europe, decided, hey, let's start cranking out these lesbian-centric vampire films. And again, a lot of them were amazing. I still watch Daughters of Darkness probably once a year, but it kind of tokenized lesbians. A lot of these films had gratuitous lesbian scenes. It was not only filmed mostly by, if not entirely by, straight men for the male gaze, but it was also exploitative in nature. However, in 1975, Lou Adler would grace us with a gift that keeps on giving, 1975's The Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was actually based on the play starring a then unknown Tim Curry called The Rocky Horror Show. But Tim Curry actually came back and played the role of Frankenfurter in the film.
Frankenfurter.
From what I understand, the casting directors didn't actually want Tim Curry because he was an unknown. But let's be honest, nobody could play Frankenfurter like Tim Curry could. Now, like the ambiguity of, is it horror, is it not horror? Rocky Horror Picture Show, despite its title with the word horror in it, is actually not technically a horror movie, but it's more of a musical / rock opera. Actually, it has people being murdered by laser gun. There's an axe murder. Space invasion is involved. Okay, yeah, maybe it is a horror film, but it wasn't meant to scare people as much as it was just meant to be full on camp. Not only does it have many campy and many horror elements, but it also has as much queer representation as films were allowing back then. Magenta and Columbia were a lesbian couple that slept in the same bed together. It was revealed in the film that the main character, Brad, was secretly bisexual when he had sex with Frankenfurter. And of course, Tim Curry himself. I cannot think of a world where there were people thinking that there could be a better actor to play Frankenfurter than Tim Curry. What? But alas, the film also didn't do too good of a job as far as portraying queer people in the best light, because Frankenfurter himself was kind of an evil man. He literally axed Meatloaf to death. He essayed a straight couple that went into his house. He was essentially a murderous drag queen once again. And say what you will about Rocky Horror Picture Show, I've seen many critiques from queer people about it. It is a movie that literally belongs in my soul. When the Rocky Horror Picture Show was actually released, it actually flopped in the box offices, but maybe 2 or 3 years later, by the late 70s, it was becoming a midnight sensation. And to this day, in pretty much every major city, you can actually go see Rocky Horror Picture Show shown in a movie theater with a cast that's playing the characters in front of the movie. People dress up, people throw things. It is the most amazing, freeing, queer experience you will probably ever have in your life. And I highly recommend if you've never done it. I've been doing it since I was probably 19 years old. So a renowned horror director who was greatly influenced by Alfred Hitchcock is an Italian man named Dario Argento. Some even credit him as the inventor of giallo films. Some say that he is the reason why so many films like Silence of the Lambs exists. No, he didn't actually invent giallo films, but he definitely popularized them and brought them into American cinema. Now, what giallo films are typically are gritty films from Italy, and they're known for their murder mystery plots. They're known for their bizarre plot twists, their shock endings. They are known for gratuitous murder scenes and lots of nudity, elaborate set designs. Dario Argento made several definitive giallo films, like Suspiria, Phenomena, his first film, Bird with the Crystal Plumage. But two of his films always stood out to me as having strangely queer undertones, and that is Deep Red and Tenebre. Now, spoiler alert, for those who haven't seen Deep Red, are you living under a rock? I'm just kidding. But for those who haven't seen Deep Red, the killer appears to be the character of Carlo, who is actually the best friend of protagonist Marcus, played by acclaimed British actor David Hemmings. So Hemmings actually finds out that his best friend Carlo in the film is gay because he meets his boyfriend, who is, I would even say, close to gender bending in the film. But when you finally meet the boyfriend, he is dressed very effeminately. Another spoiler alert, it's actually revealed in Deep Red that Carlo's mother is actually the killer. What I always found weird about this film is that Carlo's homosexuality was meant to be another shocker, a distraction, red herring. Basically, it was included so that we could forget or minimize the possibility that the killer could actually be another person, aka his mother. And again, like Psycho, the shocking twist of Deep Red is that yet another queer person goes on a murderous rampage. Not looking good for us, New Wavers. You like my shirt. Now, 1982's Tenebre was another giallo film directed by Dario Argento that had just as much, if not more, overt queerness. Instead of the killer being queer, a lesbian couple was actually written in as the double victim. And while it's okay that the final killer, for a change, wasn't actually a queer person, Tenebre actually features a very brutal double homicide scene of the murdering of a lesbian couple. Which to me feels just as problematic as the actual killer being queer, trans, gay. And Dario Argento, as much as I love him, he did actually portray this lesbian couple in this film with some very negative stereotypes.
Hey, he's cute.
He's vulgar and cheap.
I love you, Tilda, but no jealous scenes. You promised. Okay. Listen, he doesn't have a place, so I'm taking him back to ours.
Oh, Christ.
Not to mention the ugly dialogue that was actually written for John Saxon's character.
Those knights want your balls because they haven't got their own.
Oh, cringe. So during the slasher craze of the late 70s and early 80s, in lieu of the success of 1978's Halloween and 1979's Friday the 13th, Sleepaway Camp swept cinema nationwide. Released in 1983. Ironically, as I was creating the notes for this episode, I actually just checked my Facebook, and there's a slasher Facebook group that I'm a part of, and I saw one of the posts basically asked people, what is the most shocking ending that you've seen? And I checked the comments, and it was one comment after another, Sleepaway Camp, Sleepaway Camp, Sleepaway Camp. Let's get into this film that I both love and hate. It begins with one of the partners of a gay couple getting killed in a boating accident. One of them actually has 2 children. and they actually watch their gay father die. So gay people are dying first. What is this, Stephen King's It? Anyway, spoiler alert, the killer themselves is actually a woman who turns out to be a man. So the main character, Angela, is actually a very shy girl who actually goes to sleepaway camp as a teenager with her cousin to Camp Arawak. So the film itself was filmed, I believe, in either New York or New Jersey. And of course, with any good slasher that takes place on a campground, campers start to get picked off one by one.
What the hell are you doing here? I bet the rest of the boys will be interested in seeing you.
However, the shock twist ending, a la Psycho, actually features Angela holding a decapitated head. But for some reason, she is butt naked, and it is revealed that her genitalia is male.
How can it be? God, she's a boy.
There's so much wrong here. I mean, I get a shock ending. I love a shock ending just as much as the next one. But the thing about Angela, it's actually revealed in the film that her drag queen mother wanted a daughter instead of a son. And so basically dressed Angela up as a girl, even though Angela was born a boy.
You see, I've always wanted a little girl. But of course, when my husband left... Oh, well, that's all water under the bridge, as I always say. Water under the bridge. But it certainly will be a nice little surprise when Richard comes home to find a little girl in the house. Yes, I've always dreamed of a little girl just like you. I mean, we already have a boy, so another one simply would not do. Oh, no, absolutely not. A little girl would be so much nicer, don't you think so, Angela?
Are you catching how problematic this is? So while John Waters openly portrayed Divine as a murderous drag queen, and Alfred Hitchcock portrayed Norman Bates as a assumed heterosexual man who just had a very bizarre fixation for his mother, the intention behind Sleepaway Camp was to make trans people not only the butt of the joke, but basically make them out to be just plain abominable. But despite the film's overt transphobia, it actually did pretty well at the box office, and it's become a cult classic. I have a love-hate relationship with this movie because this was one of the films that I actually watched as a teenager through a 14-year-old's pair of eyes. I didn't see how problematic it was, but as I got older and as I became a therapist to the queer community, I was like, this is fucked. So with the exception of John Waters, you are probably realizing that by now, most if not all queer representation in horror was basically made to portray people like me as murderous, as abominable, monstrous, and the only time that they weren't is when they were basically being exploited in films like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, like with the lesbian couple, or the male gaze vampire softcore porn in the lesbian vampire subgenre of horror. And basically most of these were filmed by straight men who just wanted to crank out footage so that other straight men could fantasize about vampires seducing each other. So fortunately and unfortunately, Tony Scott, who's actually the brother of Ridley Scott behind the Aliens franchise, Tony Scott actually kept up the tradition of straight male directs vampire softcore porno with the incomparable film The Hunger. So The Hunger is one of those films that, okay, it's problematic because it's directed by, again, a straight male, has very, very heavy lesbian undertones.
I'm sorry, what did you say? Nothing. But I would like to talk to you. All right. Yes, I'd like that.
And yet, it's one of my favorite films because it features Bauhaus in the introduction. It features one of my all-time favorite human beings to ever live I don't even think calling him human is appropriate, but David Bowie. David Bowie is in the first 30 minutes of the film. It also features Susan Sarandon, who portrayed the terminally bland Janet Weiss in the earlier mentioned Rocky Horror Picture Show. Susan Sarandon plays a female scientist who actually becomes the object of desire for lesbian vampire portrayed by Catherine Deneuve.
I don't mean to intrude, but I didn't hear from you. I don't know why I'm here. Come in.
It's interesting to note about this film is not only does it feature a lesbian plotline, but also David Bowie was queer himself. Even though by the time that he died in 2016, he had been married to Somalian supermodel Iman. But in the 1970s, he was very open about his bisexuality. He was probably one of the first, if not the first, mainstream music artists to really have fun with gender bending. And that Thunderbolt design that's literally everywhere now is because of David Bowie, who had the Thunderbolt painted on his face. Even though I'm slightly complaining about The Hunger, it is still one of my favorite films to ever exist. It is so craftily done, it is so artistically done, and it lives just like Rocky Horror Picture Show. It lives in here. It lives in my heart, my soul. It's one of my favorite films of all time. Finally, with queer representation in horror films, we get to 1991's Silence of the Lambs. One would think that since it features openly lesbian actress Jodie Foster as the main character, well, one could argue that Anthony Hopkins plays the main character as Dr. Hannibal Lecter, but that's another story.
Good morning.
But on paper, since Jodie Foster plays the protagonist, you would think that queer representation in this film would finally be favorable for us. Perhaps not.
Perhaps not.
Now, Anthony Hopkins is an absolutely legendary actor, and we must protect him at all costs. He is still alive. I'm guessing he's probably pushing 90 by now. In my mind, he's remembered for two roles. One of them is the doctor that he played in The Elephant Man in 1980, directed by David Lynch. And the other one is Dr. Hannibal Lecter in 1991's Silence of the Lambs. Dr. Hannibal Lecter is portrayed helping Jodie Foster's character, who actually, Jodie Foster plays a very new FBI agent who's on the hunt to find a really twisted serial killer.
Mister, my family will pay cash. Whatever ransom you're asking for, they'll pay it.
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
Yes, you will, precious. You will get the hose.
Okay.
So since Dr. Hannibal Lecter in the film actually was part of a network of serial killers who all had different kinks and different fetishes, Buffalo Bill's fetish was to find women, skin them alive, and wear their skin as part of his clothing. But in the film, some of you might remember the infamous scene where he is dancing around to Q Lazarus's Goodbye Horses, dressed in drag with a full frontal tuck. Once again, queer horror representation proves to be bleak by the time the 90s roll around with Silence of the Lambs, because the killer, once again, is a murderous drag queen. Again, there's so much ambivalence with this film, just like there is with The Hunger, just like there is with Sleepaway Camp, just like there is with Rocky Horror Picture Show. There's so much ambivalence to it because it doesn't paint queer people in the best light, but no one can deny Silence of the Lambs being a freaking masterpiece. It won Academy Awards. Horror films rarely, if ever, win any kind of Academy Award, much less ever get nominated. But despite the film's success, recognition, immortality, it doesn't help my suspicions that queer people are hideously misrepresented in horror films. And again, they're mostly portrayed either as cisgender lesbian women, particularly for the male gaze, or it's either a gay man, like in Deep Red, or like Psycho, Sleepaway Camp, Silence of the Lambs, the list goes on and on and on. It's a murderous drag queen / trans person. Now, it's no surprise that Hollywood has been covertly and overtly accused of being racist, misogynistic, and predatory. But my first 6 feet deep dive essentially confirmed my fear that queer representation in horror films falls quite flat and leaves a lot to be desired. It seems that queer folks are usually portrayed as murderous monsters, especially when gender expansion is invoked or portrayed. Almost as if they are the butt of the joke, the freak of nature. Or oppositely, when lesbians are portrayed on camera, it's usually directed by a straight man for probably other straight men. Either way, oof. Comment below if you think that I missed any important queer portrayals in horror, and I'm sure I missed so many. Or comment below if you actually can think of some positive queer portrayals in horror films, because it was frankly hard to find any. A queer protagonist? Imagine that. So New Wavers, I hope you all enjoyed my first foray into my new web series 6 Feet Deep Dive. I shall make it a promise not only to myself, but to all of you to try to do this at least once a week. And if you haven't done so already, please like, comment, share, and most importantly, if we vibe, subscribe. Mwah.
Oh, I just love success.